Good afternoon, and welcome to episode 5 of our COVID-19 Religion and Belief webinar series. Today, our speakers will focus on multilateral organizations, and the panel will be chaired by Dr. Judd Birdsall, Director of Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies. You should see right now a poll on your screen, and I invite you to respond to give you and our speakers an idea of our global audience. So thank you in advance. For your information, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on social media. The recording will be available on our series landing page, where we also publish information about our upcoming episodes. And you can see the link of our landing page on the chat box. You can also ask and upvote questions at any time using the Q&A tool that is on the bottom of your screen. Please keep in mind to keep your questions, your text short and brief to allow us to better sort all of the questions. If you get disconnected, just use the same link that you have received to connect and when you register to join back in. Finally, I would like to recognize the sponsoring institutions of this webinar series: the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies, the Center for Religious Studies at Bruno Kessler Foundation, the Center for Justice and Society at Fundação Getúlio Vargas Law School of Rio de Janeiro, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University's Law School, the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the University of Siena. So without any further ado, I will now broadcast the results of the live poll, and I will leave the rest of the time to Dr. Birdsall and our great panelists. Judd, the time is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Francesco, for all you're doing to put these webinars together and to publicize them and bring together these panels. I'm really, really grateful. Grateful also to our sponsoring organizations that you've just mentioned. And welcome to all of you who are joining this call from around the world. We're delighted that you're here with us today. In preparation for this call, I was thinking about that line we often hear when we travel by airplane, when we used to do that back in the day before this pandemic, when you would land at a new airport and one of the stewards would say something like, "We know you have your choice of airline, so thank you for flying United or Lufthansa or British Airways." And now during this pandemic, there are so many interesting Zoom calls with fantastic speakers. So I'm thankful to you, knowing that you have your choice of Zoom calls that you've selected to spend this next hour with us. Today, we've put together an outstanding panel of officials from the UN, the EU, the OSCE, and the OIC to help us think through how multilateral organizations are responding to this crisis, particularly in their engagement and partnership with religious and belief groups, and in their promotion of freedom of religion or belief. The pandemic has presented unprecedented challenges for both multilateral organizations and for religious communities. Multilaterals are facing widespread suspicion, even disregard, as many national governments look inward for solutions to the crisis and for procuring medical equipment. There's been a rise in suspicion of globalization and international cooperation. The challenges for religious and belief groups are ones that we've addressed in previous panels: a rise in intolerance, and of course the total suspension of normal religious life, the inability to visit religious sites, to have visitations by clergy, to have the normal rituals related to birth, marriage, and death, and so on. But we've also seen religious groups and multilateral organizations respond in new and creative ways, and I'm sure we'll hear about some of those ways in the course of our hour together today. In advance of this webinar, I sent each of our panelists a series of 4 questions, perhaps to help shape their interventions. Let me just read those so they're all fresh in our minds, and then I'll introduce our panelists. Those questions were: how is the pandemic affecting your multilateral institutions' engagement with religious and belief groups? Second, what is the added value of multilateral organizations when it comes to engaging with religious and belief groups and promoting freedom of religion or belief and religious tolerance? Third, as the pandemic seems in many cases to be reinforcing nationalism and even xenophobia, how can multilateral organizations and religious groups work together to foster international cooperation and respect? And finally, what are likely to be some of the long-term implications of the present crisis for freedom of religion or belief, or religious tolerance, and the role of religious engagement within multilateral organizations? We've assembled just an outstanding panel to help us think through these questions. First, we have Maretta Bilde, who is a senior policy advisor at the European External Action Service, also the co-founder and co-chair of the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy, a network of diplomats with a secretariat that I'm honored to serve as director here at the University of Cambridge. We have Her Excellency Ismat Jahan, who is ambassador and head of the Permanent Observer Mission of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to the EU. Dr. Kishan Manocha, who is senior advisor on freedom of religion or belief in the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And finally, Dr. Ibrahim Salama, who is chief of the Human Rights Treaties branch within the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights at the United Nations. We've asked each of our panelists to speak for about 5 minutes during our introductory session, and then we'll use the remainder of our time for Q&A. Just to reiterate what Francesco said in terms of asking questions, you can ask a question at any time during our time together. Click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And please do be succinct in your question and let us know to whom you are addressing your question. If you submit a whole paragraph, it's very unlikely we'll be able to give attention to figure out what exactly the question is. So just give us a couple of lines. We'll try to get through as many of the questions as we can. Now our panelists will speak in order that they're listed in the invitation email. So first, the floor is over to Maretta Bilde. Thank you.
Well, technically enabled, thus unmuted. Thank you very much, Jot, and thank you very much to the organizers for allowing me to be part of this conversation on the engagement with religious and faith-based actors in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. You heard last week from some of my colleagues in Brussels how it has impacted our pursuit of freedom of religion and belief, as well as the Article 17 dialogue. What I will do here is, in my private capacity, try to unpack what this pandemic means for us in terms of policy and engagement. It's very important to underscore that this is not one challenge, but it is a series of several challenges that we need to address simultaneously. I will highlight 4 with an eye to our topic here today. The first and foremost is obviously the pandemic being a health crisis. The UN Secretary General said very wisely that the virus does not discriminate, but its impact does. It's very important that we, through that acknowledgement, realize that we also have a responsibility among those, or towards those who are the most vulnerable, both in our own societies, but also in the world more widely. I can refer to the EU Special Representative Gilmore, who very early on put out his message and his line, which is that this is first and foremost a right to health challenge, one that concerns all, and as I said, including the most vulnerable. Secondly, the virus and the pandemic has also shown that this is becoming more and more a challenge to the values such as tolerance, solidarity, and inclusion. We have certainly seen acts of great solidarity and compassion worldwide, but we have also seen a fair amount of scapegoating. Fear and exclusionary politics have led to a flare-up of intolerance and incitement. Again, among the vulnerable and marginalized groups in society are minorities, both those based on religion and faith, but also ethnic minorities. That asks of us a certain attention. Thirdly, collateral to the virus is and can be seen some of the human rights and our general policy to promote and protect democracy. It's no news to anyone to say that the crisis has been a pretext for increased repressive measures, weakenings of checks and balances, as well as diluting of rules of law. What do we do? With whom do we act? That's a very fair question. Again, here, there's also been used as an excuse to clamp down on human rights in general, and including FORP. Fourthly, and I think that's a very important point for our discussion here today, is we are already at the process where we have to learn from this crisis as we go ahead and prepare for the world of tomorrow. The EU is already examining its strategic response to the pandemic in the medium-term perspective. This involves reflections on health, public security, climate, economy, and democracy. And that reflection is going on together with the UN and its different agencies, the G7, the G20, etc. So to say how this will impact on our way of engaging really has to be unpacked and looked at in each of these, shall I say, challenges. This broad agenda, for it to succeed, will need a strong global-local partnership anchored not only in multilateral but also multi-stakeholder approach. We've seen amazing calls for action at the level of government, at the level of religious leaders as well. We've seen government exchanges, but also government religious leaders. Today, the president of the commission, of the council, is having a conversation with the Pope. And also at the grassroots level, there are challenges to be picked up. So to answer your question, the pandemic asks for us a renewed partnership with all relevant civil society actors, including its religious and faith-based components. And I stress the word partnership. It's not a question of turning to sort of people who you would think is firefighters and can go out and do a work you can't do yourself, but it's also to inspire the policies as we go ahead. And that's why I think it's very important that also in the lessons learned that the contributions by faith-based and religious voices be heard. This is the kind of work which is not new to the EU. In fact, you will maybe know that we have set up this EU exchange platform on religion and society, and where the philosophy is precisely to give voice and visibility also to the contribution of religion and faith-based actors. But I think also it's important, and maybe we can come back to that in the question, that we are not looking at a panacea, and we are not looking at a untroubled partnership. We need to engage selectively, we need to engage smartly in order to achieve what it is we're set out to do. Joint efforts, inspire policies, again, that will be the challenge. I don't know if I should go further into the other questions or wait for question answers from you, George, but I would say to sum up, this is a challenge that has put renewed focus on why it is that governments alone can't do it, and why it is that we need to be smart to know who is it out there that can help us understand how the world looks and works, including from the most vulnerable perspective.
Great. Thank you so much, Maretta, for your opening intervention. We'll go straight over to Ambassador Jahan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Budzell and the organizers for this opportunity. Good afternoon to all, and Ramadan Mubarak to all those who are practicing. Let me also say that our thoughts are with you all. Perhaps even among the audience, there are some people who have been affected by the deadly coronavirus pandemic directly or indirectly. And our particular condolences go to those who have lost their loved ones. At the outset, I'd also like to pay special tribute to the frontline health workers. The global outbreak of COVID-19 has emerged, as we have been talking about, as one of the biggest threats facing humankind, and it is spreading rapidly across the globe, completely changing people's lives. And we have a deep sense of helplessness, I must say that, having to fight a battle against an invisible and so far an invincible enemy. That is the sense of helplessness. But given the scale and magnitude of the spread and severity of the pandemic, global solidarity, cooperation are urgent in addressing the multifaceted challenges posed by the pandemic. The previous speaker, my friend Merete, has already spoken about how important that solidarity is, and particularly multilateral organizations to get together. I'd like to refer to the perspective and efforts undertaken by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is abbreviated as OIC. Firstly, the organization considers that the global response should be transparent, I would stress, should be transparent, robust, well coordinated, and scientifically oriented to contain the pandemic effectively. To this end, the organization from the very beginning has expressed its solidarity with the regional and multilateral partners, including the United Nations family, the European Union, the non-aligned movement, to work together in addressing the far-reaching health, socio-economic, and humanitarian consequences on the national, regional, and global scale. So it has to be on national, regional, as well as global, of course. The organization has welcomed the outcome of the G20 Extraordinary Summit, which also provided a good basis for the coordinated global fight. Furthermore, the OIC has also expressed full support to the World Health Organization and its commitment to strengthen its mandate in coordinating the international fight, including the protection of frontline health workers, delivery of medical supplies, testing kits, treatments, and vaccines. You know, vaccine is still not around, but some efforts have been undertaken, and very recently we saw that the European Union had one online pledging, which was very impressive towards research on vaccines. The organization's primary concern has been promotion of urgent actions to prevent loss of lives in the member states of the organization and to assist them in their efforts to curb the spread. To this end, at the very outset, the Secretary General of the OIC, Dr. Al-Utaimin, reaffirmed the OIC's readiness to provide necessary support to these member states in addressing the immediate health challenges, as well as in dealing with the social and economic consequences, particularly in protecting the vulnerable economic groups in the societies, as for example, the daily wage earners whose livelihoods, as we know, are most affected. The Islamic Solidarity Fund, a subsidiary organ of the OIC, has also set up a dedicated account to assist the affected member states, especially the least developed ones, as well as the African OIC members, which are in a vulnerable and disadvantaged situation to cope with the pandemic, particularly in the health sector. The Islamic Development Bank has also launched a $2.2 billion strategic preparedness and emergency response program for the member states to contain the negative effects of the pandemic. And the OIC Steering Committee on Health has also met in early April and adopted a number of important recommendations. Let me also say that in other levels, the foreign ministers of the OIC Executive Committee had an extraordinary teleconference in April, and they urged for continued coordination of global COVID-19 response efforts, including in scientific research. While commending member states for taking timely precautionary measures and national preparedness, they had underlined the need for continued efforts to reach out to the public through sensitization of national responses and awareness building plans on the seriousness of the virus. To this end, the OIC underlines the importance of responsible use of ICTs to ensure dissemination of correct information related to the pandemic to the public, and to take all measures to combat misinformation and fake news. The OIC General Secretariat has launched an awareness campaign in 3 languages, English, Arabic, and French, through its various social media platforms to raise awareness of the seriousness of the pandemic, as well as to disseminate the best practices of member states in dealing with the pandemic. The OIC recognizes the important role that the religious community and faith leaders, Islamic scholars, and prominent figures can, and in fact does play, we have seen, in raising public awareness about the deadly virus, as well as about necessary personal hygiene and appropriate social behaviors which are important to curb the spread. The pandemic has in fact also impacted the way one practices acts of worship. In this regard, the OIC also appreciates the efforts made by the member states and their religious leaders to prevent the spread of the pandemic, including by the temporary closure of mosques and places of worship in upholding social distancing measures. It also appreciated the timely decision taken by Saudi Arabia to suspend Umrah, that's a pilgrimage to the holy Mecca, and the visits to the Prophet's mosque. The OIC International Islamic Fiqh Academy also met to review the various fiqh aspects of the pandemic, and several physicians and Sharia experts who participated in the symposium discussed the provisions related to the pandemic, especially with the approach of the holy month of Ramadan. The timely symposium helped to reconcile the opinions of scientists and physicians on one hand, and the Sharia scholars on the other regarding the outbreak of the disease, in a bid to formulate a harmonious position that supports the efforts of decision makers in the member states. I should say that the OIC, as well as the Independent Permanent Human Rights Commission, had urged the international community to ensure the well-being and protection of the rights of the marginalized segments, the people who are marginalized and vulnerable, in particular, those living under foreign occupation or in conflict zones, the religious or ethnic minorities, the migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and displaced persons. These groups of persons whose rights are often forgotten even during the normal times are even more vulnerable to the impacts of COVID-19. We all know that. Overcrowded refugee camps and urban areas with lack of sanitation makes social distancing impossible, and they also became more vulnerable to the shocks of aftershocks of the pandemic in the social and in the economic arena. The international community must not, and I should say the media also, must not lose sight of the unique circumstances and the impact of the ongoing crisis on these vulnerable people. The OIC had called for the member states to look after the well-being of the refugees and also called on the international community to pay special attention to the situation in Palestine by extending support to the people and lifting restrictions on the entry of humanitarian assistance. There is, of course, a very strong need for a special focus on the gendered impact of COVID-19, especially in the family and the communities where we see there are reports of increased violence against women and domestic violence. The special situation of children, the elderly, and the persons with disability must be factored in all the protection and response plans of the international community at a global level. The homeless people, we should not forget them, as well as those who are in prison and detention centers. Ms. Bilde, she mentioned about the renewed partnership. It's very important, and it's also very important to partner with the NGOs and the civil society actors. I would say that in view of the rapidly unfolding global humanitarian crisis, the OIC has also urged on all the parties in the conflict areas to declare a ceasefire and to allow humanitarian assistance to reach all affected people. In this context, the Secretary General has strongly supported the UN Secretary General's appeal for global ceasefire. Now, as many of you may know, that the Organization of Islamic Cooperation is not a religious organization per se, but a political body comprising 57 member states, and it's second to the United Nations in terms of membership. However, promotion of interreligious and intercultural dialogue remains very strong priority of the organization. And the situation of Muslim in non-Muslim country is also a priority concern of the organization. To this effect, the organization has been deeply concerned by instances of discriminatory and intolerant speech, treatment, and violence against Muslims, including hate crimes during this time in some countries. Referring to recent media accounts of rising anti-Muslim sentiments and Islamophobia within the political and media circles in India, where the Indian Muslim minority has been blamed for the spread of the coronavirus, the OIC Secretariat has strongly rejected such prejudicial targeting of Muslims. During this current situation, we'd like to see more active cooperation and solidarity mechanism worldwide, and a stronger mutual aid amongst all citizens of the same country to start with. There are also reports that the new measures are finding discriminatory impact on religious minorities in some countries, including the Muslims. There are reports that Muslims who died of coronavirus are also subject to forced cremation in certain countries, despite the advisory of the WHO. And we also know of religious and racial profiling also. Sometimes the Asian-looking people are unfortunately targeted and often attacked for seemingly, alleging that they are the origin of the virus. I would like to end by saying that the OIC Secretary General is mandated to continue initiatives and coordination with international actors. And I don't know if I have lost connection. Hello? Hello?
Yeah,
yes.
Please continue.
There was an, I don't know if I lost connection because there was an incoming call. Can you hear me? To
Yes.
this end, the OIC looks forward to joining efforts with the UN and the European Union, and acknowledges the central role that the UN plays in strengthening international cooperation, and has called upon the United Nations, the OIC, in a foreign ministerial meeting to convene an extraordinary session during the 74th UN General Assembly to examine and determine appropriate actions to improve combating pandemics similar to the novel coronavirus disease. And let me just make just one concluding remark that I do not wish to sound pessimist, but on a very cautious optimism, let me say that the principle of social or physical distancing would remain, and so would be the frequent hand washing directives would remain, or a new hygiene that would remain for some times. perhaps we have to live with the fact that the so-called normal days might not come back anytime soon. Restriction will be the norm for a long time. And I think this is very important for everybody, all those who are listening and everybody, that together we can make a difference in containing the spread. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Jahan, for your remarks and for being with us today. Now, straight over to Dr. Manocha.
Thank you, Judd. Good afternoon, Judd. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to participate in this webinar and in this series of webinars that I've followed with great interest. And I must say, Judd, thank you for posing some very relevant and very important questions. And I'll do my best to pick up on a few of the ideas that you have seeded and then comment maybe more generally around the issue of religious engagement and multilaterals in the age of COVID-19 and beyond. The first thing I would say in terms of the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and you can speak on behalf of its Freedom of Religion or Belief program, is that, of course, our engagement, our work with religious or belief communities in the OSCE region has changed quite dramatically because of the pandemic. We have moved entirely to an online engagement, but we are doing our best to monitor two aspects of the pandemic. One is the impact of measures that have been taken in response by national governments, by participating states, on the right to freedom of religion or belief and issues around tolerance and non-discrimination on grounds of religion or belief, but also the response of religious or belief communities, religious or belief actors, religious leaders to the pandemic, and also interfaith, multi-faith type responses. And we've been monitoring this and doing our best to encourage communities and actors through online engagement primarily, and tailoring whatever support we can provide accordingly. And I just wanted to sort of comment on a couple of issues here in relation to the restrictions and the response. Yes, we know that there have been extensive, widespread restrictions on freedom of religion or belief on the grounds of public health, which is a ground for restricting this human right. Fine. I guess the concern is, what are the implications moving forward, particularly? What will be the residual effects on communities and on freedom of religion or belief? We need to be watching that, need to be noting that carefully, and as ODIHR, reminding participating states of their commitments in this area. But then, are we in the post-COVID world likely to see new types of freedom of religion or belief violation emerging, as some governments with a particular authoritarian or control mindset and approach use the pandemic and its aftermath as a pretext, as a cloak for further widespread restrictions and or the introduction of discriminatory provisions on grounds of religion or belief. And I think particularly in light of the measures around surveillance and artificial intelligence and the impact that they could have disproportionately on religious or belief actors, religious or belief communities. So we need to bear that in mind. But then when it comes to the broader response of religious or belief actors, and despite the limitations that have been imposed, physical distancing, social distancing, and other challenges, they have, in the OSCE region and beyond, played a remarkably resourceful, strategic role in combating the pandemic. And other contributors to this series of webinars and other webinars on the pandemic and religion and belief have discussed this exhaustively. But I've been particularly struck by the creativity, the adaptability, the resourcefulness, the degree to which religious belief actors have, in some cases, been the first responders when the authorities have not been able to cater adequately for the vulnerable and the needy. But beyond that, they have also been, in many, many cases, the voices that have rallied not just their co-religious and co-believers, but wider society, wider communities around values that are essential to combat the pandemic. Values of unity, values of solidarity, hope, compassion. If you like, what we're seeing here is a very heightened, strong voice emerging from a number of religious or belief actors throughout the region and beyond, that are looking beyond narrow self-interest to a common vision of society. So we see, in terms of the religious or belief response, if you like, the social capital of religion or belief being expressed in concrete acts of service, awareness raising, protection of health, but also what some commentators have described as the social imaginaries that represents a real potential of religion and belief, but a less well-considered potential of religion or belief to contribute to the ongoing imaginative renewal of our reality as social beings of society and ultimately of global society. And it's this particular contribution that I'm interested in seeing it being developed, being that potential being exploited by multilateral organizations as they come to terms with the changing geopolitical, social, cultural, religious, emotional landscape before us. The need to, by multilaterals, including particularly the one that I work for, the OAC, to reconceptualize, rethink, reimagine social peace, reimagine security, and the COVID-19 pandemic is a major driver in this process of reimagining what human security, what sustainable security now needs to look like and engage the powerful voice of religion in that discourse, in that discussion. So it's not a question of just taking religion and mixing it into the equation, so to speak, but actually to draw on those insights, to draw on that contribution. And the other point I think that's related here and relevant here is it's not just a question of religious or belief actors as voices that only articulate values in relation to, say, security building in its widest sense, because the reconceptualization, the rethinking of our understanding of security in its broader sense will require addressing problems from not a control mindset, fixing this and fixing that, but to a empowerment approach that really enables individuals, communities to take charge of their destiny, to become protagonists in their own social, economic advancement. And in this regard, freedom of religion or belief is critical and it's essential if we are to harness the resources of all, the human resources of all in our society, and to empower them and to ensure that they're able to empower themselves. And so that right and that value is playing itself out in fascinating ways at the moment, despite restrictions, and will have a deep and abiding relevance as we move forward, which means that multilateral organizations with their normative frameworks, their political commitments, will have to watch very, very carefully for disproportionate and unnecessary restrictions on freedom of religion or belief now, during the lifetime of the pandemic and beyond.
Great, thank you so much, Kishan. And now finally over to Dr. Salama.
Very much. Good afternoon to all. Very happy to join this reflection. Just to build on all what has been said already, my personal view from a UN and a human rights office perspective, is that Kishan just mentioned the normative framework. The dichotomy about the normative framework in these times, it's that it's being challenged. For example, many of the usual functioning of the architecture of human rights mechanisms is challenged even for the sake of meeting. So the capacity of the system is being challenged. At the same time, the normative and the standards needed have never been more relevant and more needed in the history of the human rights architecture. Multilateralism has been already under strain even before COVID-19. So COVID-19 exacerbated already a situation of pushback against human rights in many forms and manifestations that vary according to times and regions, from populism to totalitarianism to challenges for democracy to the lack of resources. So now, from the point of view of the Office of the High Commissioner, I think the COVID-19 situation brought a number of positive and a number of extremely challenging elements. On the positive side, I would say immediately, automatically, the increase of the value and importance of the role of non-state actors and the civil society, which has been under pressure. But now, even those governments who did not use to welcome to open their civil society space as much as it should be, now they're obliged to do so, because without the people, you cannot handle a lot of the policy issues that are needed to combat the health crisis. Secondly, the level of solidarity is higher than ever and is more needed than ever. And again, this is an element which goes in the sense of the human rights values. Number three, seen from a perspective of faith actors and religious actors, I think in a way this crisis should have a kind of humbling effect, in the sense that these actors are so powerful and so nearer to the individuals and communities and to the victims of the current challenges and abuses, that we really should listen to them more genuinely. It's not only about, I think, renewing our partnership with them, it's really rethinking our partnership with them in the sense of genuinely empowering them to play the role that they need to play. The immediate challenges from a human rights office perspective, in my personal view, is to be crisp and clear about what do we mean by a rights-based approach to dealing with a crisis like this. One has to be very concrete in this area and show what elements of public policies, actions or inactions need what component of human rights to be more compatible with the norms and more sustainable and impactful on the ground. One of the immediate results that are negative in terms of human rights is deepening inequalities between people. And at the same time, by the same idea of deepening inequalities, the COVID-19 brought also an extremely powerful reality that I'm not sure we contemplated enough, which is that nobody is safe unless everybody is safe. So on one hand, it deepens inequalities because the vulnerable and the poor and the minorities and the weaker economically suffer more. But at the same time, the virus does not recognize power, authority, status, borders. So it attacks also the rich and famous and powerful. So on one hand, it deepens, and on the other hand, it empowers. So, and I think it's a very strong human rights message for us to contemplate. We see a lot of talking about the impact on civil and political rights, which is absolutely true. But one of the main elements on which we do not yet have enough empirical evidence is the inequalities in front of the right to health. The violations of the equal treatment in this respect should be the highest, logically, in these times. But given the focus on the health dimension of it, we did not yet penetrate to the crux of the structural inequalities in terms of enjoying the right to health in these circumstances. of course, the first reaction to an epidemic, it's to isolate yourself, which is against the value of human rights, which is to the togetherness and the solidarity. International cooperation as well is relatively at risk of ceding its place to competition and to isolationism and to egoism. And we see shocking manifestations of this type of, at times, even intergovernmental behavior. What would be the added value of international organizations in this respect? It's precisely the fact that it is based on international cooperation, that it provides the space and the tools and the standards and the frameworks for this cooperation to happen. If I look at it finally from a perspective of the faith leaders themselves, I think, as I said, it's not only renewing commitment and interaction with them, it's just rethinking and trying to learn with them. I'm thinking of two relatively weak approaches before the crisis that could benefit from the crisis. One is the global approach to religious actors versus the sectorial stroke, if I dare to say, opportunistic from time to time, where you just need to rely on them on this or on that, as opposed to a global approach that recognizes the religious and faith-based organizations as a powerful non-state actors across the wide range of the multilateral spectrum and agenda. And the second one is the empowerment. It's not about teaching them anything. It's about giving and taking between them, among each others, and between them and other actors in society and governments. In that respect, and I will finish on that point, we in the Office of the High Commissioner has been trying to promote, even before the COVID-19 context, a global approach to religious actors in terms of their responsibilities towards all human rights. For us, FORB is a central human rights, but it does not exhaust the role and impact and potential of religion vis-a-vis human rights. Religion impacts positively and negatively, according to the interpretation and to the region and to the communities, on each and every human rights, not only on the freedom of religion or belief. So the faithful rights approach, which is a set of commitments, 18 commitments elaborated by faith actors, a combination of faith actors and human rights experts, including on freedom of religion or belief. This set of standards we had developed just before the crisis into a toolkit as a peer-to-peer learning. And here comes the second potential innovation or benefit of the crisis, which is the empowerment approach. And empowerment not in the sense of capacity building, in the sense of top-down or just lecturing or enhancing their own capacities by an external actor, but really through a peer-to-peer learning events. And we will start shortly to pilot events like this one, webinars with faith actors in the area of learning in particular segments of the implications and the challenges posed by the COVID-19. How have they been handling it? What were the challenges and what are their lessons learned? And we believe that through this bottom-up continuous empowering, and by empowering we don't mean multilateralism, the UN empowering them. No, we mean they empowering each other, and they learn from each other, and we too learn from them. Thank you very much. Back to you. Looking forward to any comments or questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Salama, for your remarks. Thanks to all the panelists for being so generous with their time and with their insights today. We just have 10 minutes for questions, so we'll have to be quite brief in our answers and quite selective in the questions that we pose. I'll try to do the best job I can in selecting some of the questions here. One quite practical one that has come in a couple of times is for Maretta regarding the EAS platform on religion and society. People are wondering what that looks like in the context of the COVID crisis and whether that platform might be used in part as sort of a post-COVID reconstruction effort.
Thank you very much, and also thank you very much to the previous speakers. I think there's definitely space for a lot of collaboration and building to the strength of each of our initiatives. To respond to the question framed by Jod, the global exchange on religion and society is precisely a nod to recognize that also the contribution of religious and faith-based matter as part of a broader civil society way of looking at how we live together. And the living together is exactly what is challenged in today's world. We will have 6 physical iterations and a number of virtual meetups as we roll out this initiative. And we have, we're in the process now of fine-tuning where those will go to, what will be the topics. And it's very clear that there is a COVID impact here, both in terms of the topics, but also in terms of the orientation of some of the microgrants that we'll be looking at. And I'd just like to stress that when we look at this, it's not to put religion up on a pedestal, but it's precisely to also acknowledge that we know there is something around the contributions that can be made either on the basis of religion or faith more broadly, but also to give voice and visibility. I'm not sure we empower. I think we should have enough humility to understand that this work is happening already. And I think Kishan is right in his praising of some of the innovation, some of the responsibility, some of the rising up we've seen. So it's more to tap into that so that we don't sit in our own hemisphere and pretend that we are each in ours the center of the universe. And that is also where we need to acknowledge that in the responses we've seen here, we've seen some amazing signs of compassion and of solidarity, but we've also sometimes seen how religion has been used not as a rallying point, but sometimes quite the opposite, or rather rallying for an exclusionary line, incitement, etc. And this is where I can see a lot of strength in combining our efforts as we go ahead. Same thing for Ibrahim and the faithful rights. I don't think we need to start all over. We have already quite a solid base to work on. I salute the good work that's been done in the UN Interagency Task Force for more than a decade. And I think also when we look at how we, government officials and policymakers, should respond, we should also not be afraid of, and here I quote probably the 3 leading figures in religious engagement who recently stated that we would be wrong to expect religion to be some sort of panacea. Religion can, if applied correctly or appropriately, be sort of a balm, but also it calls upon the family of religious and faith-based actors to really now come together across the various divides that they have in order to mitigate harmful consequences of the coronavirus. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a lot of learning on both sides, and that what we are looking to do is to understand how we can enrich all of us to respond to what is basically a global challenge, which will need to be responded to with all hands on boards and a solid anchoring in a human rights-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Marita, for that. Kishan, some questions for you regarding the OSCE, how the OSCE is engaging with countries, with member countries that are enacting either discriminatory restrictions or perhaps even discriminatory privilege for religious groups. What does that engagement look like with those countries? And also the practical question came in about how you are actually monitoring situations on the ground given the restrictions during this time.
Thank you, Judd, and thank you for those passing on those questions. Well, the ODIHR, OSCE, and ODIHR has for many years been monitoring compliance by participating states on their commitments on freedom of religion or belief. Where they fall short, we have a number of approaches, a number of tools that we deploy, including public statements, including private correspondence with the relevant participating state. But we don't just leave it at the level or in the realm of words and diplomacy, because then if the participating state is open and willing, we can offer technical assistance, and we can offer in particular capacity building for state officials to ensure that in a practical sense, their policies and laws, well, they have the understanding of what the international commitments on freedom of religion and belief, the OSCE commitments look like, what they stipulate, what international standards stipulate, so that when they come to enact laws, policies, and practices, they are international, compliant with international standards. We also review legislation and offer comments on draft and emerging legislation, again to ensure that they are compliant with commitments, in line with commitments. When it comes to monitoring at this particular time, yes, it is very challenging, and we draw in large part from a network of civil society partners and colleagues, religious belief communities included in that group, human rights defenders working on religious belief issues and on freedom of religion or belief in particular, and also our OSCE field operations and missions in a number of participating states that are very much closer to the ground and will flag up any issues for our notice. ODIHR also is assisted by a panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief, and we're in constant communication with them. And from time to time, individual panel members will flag up issues in the countries that they live or know best or associate with. So we're able to build a pretty comprehensive picture at this time, despite the challenges in terms of access to information, contact, and communication.
Great. Thank you, Kishan. We just have 2 minutes left in our time together. So I'm going to pull together a couple of questions and just ask and combine them into one general question that I'll pose to any and all panelists, perhaps starting with Ambassador Jahan, and then Dr. Salama, and then to Kishan and Maretta if they want to touch on this. But it's at once intensely practical, but also gets to the heart of this issue of the value of multilateral organizations. And that is, what can multilateral organizations be doing at this time to ensure that medical supplies, and hopefully before too long a vaccine, are distributed fairly, that there's no discrimination between countries or within countries, between different communities. There was also the question that relates to this in terms of the sharing of medical supplies between countries. Is that a sign of solidarity, or more cynically, is that just a tool, is that medical diplomacy right now that some countries may be using? So I want to first pose that question to Ambassador Jahan in terms of what can or are multilateral groups doing now to ensure the fair distribution of medical supplies and hopefully in time a vaccine. Ambassador Jahan.
There is always, this time, as you see that, there has to be a global response, because whether a country is rich or poor, or for that matter, powerful economically, politically, it's very important that to address the pandemic, it has to be that, the others are also strong, equally strong, because, if a country has the resources, it cannot by itself stop the pandemic from spreading further, maybe temporarily. But if the other parts of the world has not been able to address it, then it will come back to the country which has cleared off itself. So there has to be a continued solidarity in terms of, you did mention a very specific one with regard to the access to medical supplies. well, vaccine has not yet come, but there are other personal protection equipments, and these are where more solidarity and cooperation is required. In the beginning, we have seen, especially also in Europe, I think, the EU also had been criticized in the beginning for not forthcoming, but, that perhaps was not a genuine, well, it was a normal criticism, but perhaps not a genuine one. But we have seen that the EU has now taken on board the requirements of other member states. Similarly, it is happening in other parts of the world. I mean, by and large, there are willingness to support. You did speak about whether it's a diplomacy, medical diplomacy. There might be, one cannot, the international order has not changed overnight. As one of the speakers says that, multilateralism has been going backstage for a little while for certain part of the world. But it is very important to bring back multilateralism and to fight the pandemic. That is very important. And I would like to say that even when we're talking about vaccine, such vaccine, when it is found, the question would remain how to ensure easy, affordable, and equitable access of the vaccine. Well, in an era of intense competition, unfortunately, we see that geopolitics of the vaccine race would be growingly complex as the medicine itself. So that is not a very good thing to say, but that will be in a way that, but we hope that when the vaccine is available, it should be equitable, easy, and affordable, even for the poorest country, and to reach within that poor country all the segment of the population. It should be equitable access. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. In the interest of time, why don't we have the final word now to Dr. Salama in response to that question about multilateral organizations in facilitating fair distribution.
Thank you very much. The issue of fair distribution will be soon on top of the priorities. And of course, there is a huge difference between the humanitarian response, which is just to give to the most needy and that's it, and the human rights response, which is how to base this on equal footing and on sustainable basis. I want to link this to a question I read myself on the list of questions on what is the faithful rights framework. It's precisely a definition of the role and responsibilities of faith actors and religious leaders with respect to human rights. And one of them is precisely the issue of the right to health and the rights of the needy and the unprivileged group in societies. If you just type faithful rights or faithful rights toolkit, you will find that in the toolkit of the peer-to-peer learning, on the modules of women's rights and on the modules of minorities, we injected specific cases to debate and examples and recent statements and developments that relate to the COVID-19. With the objective of giving an example of how faith leaders can themselves be vectors of equal treatment on the ground. It will not only happen because of governments. Finally, I link this to the question of Professor Morelli about the link between solidarity and religions. I would even go further, that it's not only particularly related to religions. I would submit that at least in the most religious traditions, the notion of economic rights and non-discrimination facing the health crisis is even more solidly entrenched than if you compare it with some human rights standards. In human rights standards, the economic rights, including the right to health, it is in a progressive manner, to be implemented in a progressive manner, and according to the availability of resources. On the religious side, and here I join Marita in saying that we should be humble with them and learn from them, they have a much higher standard. Let's face it, which is a good thing. They can be of inspiration to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists for their insights, for their reflections, for giving up their time. And I felt like this is a very rich and quite positive and encouraging conversation. So thank you to all of you for your contributions. Thanks again to our co-sponsoring organizations and to Francesco for facilitating these conversations and making them possible. Francesca, over to you for a final word.
Thank you so much, Judd, and thank you for being with us today. Let me allow to give the proper recognition and thanks to the panelists and all of those who have worked behind the scene. You can now see all of us on the screen. It has been a very interesting discussion, and again, thanks to our chair and panelists for your contributions. And thank you for giving us your time to be with us and for your engagement and participation. Now, I'm happy to announce our next two webinars. Next week, episode 6, will focus on Central and South America. We will have great speakers from that part of the world. And episode 7 in 2 weeks will focus on the pandemic and the intersection of economics, religion, and business. Another interesting discussion there as well. Registration will open soon, so keep an eye on our landing page and our follow-up emails. Again, we look forward to welcoming you next week, and we wish you a wonderful week. Thank you so much, and have a good week.